Good afternoon. I'm Kenneth Lepotin, Curator of Antiquities here at the Getty Villa, and today we have a special treat for you both in the auditorium and online. Three world-renowned experts will be speaking about the challenges of reading and understanding the carbonized papyrus scrolls from the Villa dei Papyri at Herculaneum, miraculously preserved by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79 and rediscovered by Neapolitan excavators digging deep beneath the surface of the earth in the 1750s. A few of these papyrus scrolls are on display here at the Getty Villa, crossing the Atlantic for the very first time. And we are extremely grateful to our colleagues at the National Library in Naples for generously lending them to us for the loan exhibition, Buried by Vesuvius, Treasures from the Villa dei Papyri, as well as our other lenders who have provided us with sculptures, frescoes, and other historic materials. The National Archaeological Museum in Naples, the Parco Archeologico di Ercolano, the Bodleian Libraries of the University of Oxford, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We are also deeply grateful to the Getty Museum's Villa Council for the support of this exhibition, and Elizabeth and Bruce Dunleavy and the Spogli Family Foundation. Today's program is co-sponsored by the American Friends of Herculaneum, and we're extremely pleased that members of both the American Friends and the British Friends of Herculaneum are here with us today, including many board members and the president and treasurer of the American Friends, Carol Matoush and Roger McFarlane, who are here today and available to answer questions after the program if you are interested. If you're interested in joining the Friends or learning more about our efforts to support the ongoing work at Herculaneum. Or, of course, you can just Google American Friends of Herculaneum. Now, for the main event. Each of our three speakers today could easily present to us for the entire afternoon, or indeed, for an entire semester, I think. And I could easily fill all available time today just by reading you the short, abbreviated introductory CVs I received from them. Truly. But so that we will have time for your questions and discussion at the end of the program, these introductions will be excessively brief. Our first speaker today has come to us all the way from Brentwood. David Blank is professor of classics at UCLA. A graduate of Yale and Princeton, he has held numerous prestigious grants and awards, including a Fulbright Fellowship to Athens, stints in Bonn, Berlin, Oxford, and elsewhere. He has won the Theodore Mommsen Award for contributions to Herculaneum papyrology and is a principal investigator of the NEH-funded Philodemus Project. His books and articles listed in even this short CV are too many to even delve into here, but they address a wide range of philological, philosophical, and papyrological issues. Professor Blank will speak today on the early history of the papyri and past attempts to read them. His title, Reading the Herculaneum Papyri, 1754 to 1864. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Blank.
There we go. Is this microphone on? Good. Thank you, Ken. Thank you all for being here. Good afternoon. So, reading the Herculaneum Papyri. Where does this start? So in some ancient philosophical schools, philosophy was not only a way of life, it was a shared inquiry into truth. We mostly think of this on the model of Socratic conversation. But later philosophers envisaged even the Platonic school as working with books, in the form of Papyrus Rolls. We're even told that Plato's pupil Aristotle was often called the Academy's reader, the one who would read aloud a text to be discussed. Don't get too impressed. This is a job usually held by a slave. However, the Academy's model was thought in the Hellenistic tradition, so after Plato's death, to involve Plato or his successors conversing while walking in the various areas of the Academy, not while sitting, as some of these people are. The first readers of the Herculaneum Papyri perhaps resembled the group pictured here, because in part, the Epicureans, at any rate, were a group that prized shared inquiry. It's usually been thought that the Epicurean philosopher Philodemus, who was born sometime around 110 in what is now Jordan, and then came to Italy probably sometime in the 70s BCE, it's usually been thought that Philodemus lived and set up such a philosophical school in the shadow of Vesuvius, in Herculaneum, in a grand seaside villa belonging to Gaius Calpurnius Piso, whom Cicero prosecuted in 55 BCE. Though a cultured man and a good philosopher, Cicero laments that Philodemus was unable to stop the perversion of the Epicurean doctrine of pleasant ease into one of debauchery. Of course, we might say that it was not the best idea to put such a school at the foot of an active volcano. But then again, 3 million people currently live in Vesuvius's red zone. And as recent excavations have shown, the villa was only built around 40 BCE, when Philodemus would have been about 70 years old. So it's possible that his school was more likely in Naples and not in Herculaneum. Still, as it turns out, it was the eruption of Vesuvius that buried Herculaneum in volcanic mud after it killed with its pyroclastic flow of superheated air those of the population who failed to escape beforehand and were huddled in caves along the waterfront. It was this same volcanic mud that preserved a cache of books, practically the only such ancient books to survive antiquity in Europe. The picture here shows Mount Vesuvius and the Sorrentine Peninsula from the International Space Station on January 1st, 2013. This is an 18th century map of the Gulfs of Gaeta and of Naples. And so we're talking about the area right here. It turns out then that the only library from the ancient world found together with its books is in this sumptuous seaside villa at Herculaneum, buried in the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, and now known for its trove of about 800 papyrus rolls. Almost all of them works of Epicurean philosophy, with a few Stoic books and a few very badly preserved Latin ones for good measure. They probably were not part of the library, but were there for other reasons. So this is the computer-generated reconstruction that you can see upstairs in the exhibit. Nice place. The villa was discovered by workers digging wells in 1750. Tunnels were dug through it over the next 4 years so that statues, candelabra, wall paintings, mosaics, and so on could be removed and brought to the Palazzo Caramanico, the summer home of the Neapolitan king. At the end of that period of exploration of the villa, which remained buried under 20 to 30 meters of volcanic mud, hardened to a concrete consistency, the Swiss engineer Karl Weber drew an accurate plan of the villa, or at least this one floor of the villa, including the tunnels by which it had been explored, and with annotations indicating what was found in various places. The original of this plan can also be seen upstairs. Among the objects found here were book rolls. They were discovered by excavators tunneling through the villa in October of 1752 through October of 1754, while they were looking for art treasures, such as the grand bronze statues, which were first found in the theater of Herculaneum. They were not looking for papyrus rolls, I can tell you that for sure. The first notice to the learned world of the discovery of the papyrus rolls was this letter, pictured here, from the curator of the Antiquities of Herculaneum, Camillo Paderni, to a friend of his, Dr. Mead, dated from Naples, November 18th, 1752, and read by Mead to a meeting of the Royal Philosophical Society in London, whence it was published. So you can see here that he wanted to illustrate a couple of lines of Latin characters that were found in the papyrus roll. It was the discovery of these characters that then led Paderni, well, Paderni makes the claim for himself, but then again he claims everything for himself. Led people to think that these were not just lumps of charcoal, but rather were ancient books. So the discoveries that were made were recorded on Weber's plan and also in the excavation leader, Alcubierre's excavation reports. Capsi, that is, traveling boxes of papyri, and clumps or even pyramids of papyri were discovered in 2 points, in points G and G on Weber's plan. And that was, so really on opposite sides of the peristyle. So, for example, here in the square peristyle, and then here also in the long peristyle, the garden peristyle. Further clumps of papyri were found in room 16 off the tablinum and in the tablinum itself. So that's this area here. That's the usually very sumptuously decorated, and in this case with various intricate marbles and so on, place where the master of the house would receive guests in the morning, people who came to curry favor. And in that room, 1 or 2 cabinets containing papyri were discovered. But those cabinets then were unable to be salvaged. They fell to pieces when they were touched and the papyri taken out of them. And then there was room 5, which was found to be surrounded in shelving. Do we see that one? Well, yes, over there. The room 5, discovered in 1754, disclosed by far the greatest number of papyri. Paderni described in some detail how he himself went down, such a hero. He went down and spent whole days in the room, digging out papyrus rolls with his bare hands, sometimes so many at a time that he couldn't carry them all. However much he exaggerated, this probably was true. But room 5, that little room that we saw, was likely a place where the villa's philosophical books were stored. Readers, on the other hand, probably took books from there to read them in a nicer environment, in the sunshine of the peristyles. The tablinum, then, the ornate room pictured here in its Malibu incarnation, would have been ideally situated for readers because it came in between the 2 peristyle courts. It was equipped with 2 cabinets in which books taken from the library could be stored for reading later or on the next day. So if you were reading a book, then you might keep it there so that it was easier for you to get at the next day. You wouldn't have to go back into the dark room 5. Plutarch, so in the 2nd century CE, not without a certain implication that this kind of luxury was a display of wealth and the pushing of power, describes Lucullus's library. So this was a friend of Cicero and many other Romans, he describes Lucullus's library accommodations as a kind of hotel and gymnasium, serving Greek visitors to Rome. Note that the Prytaneon, which he also talks about, so was also the Hestia, or the sacred hearth of the city of Athens, and a place where dining and congregating were done, as was also the museum. Cicero, on the other hand, thinks that the young Lucullus, whose library he uses to take out books when he's on vacation at his own villa in Tusculum, should soon become acquainted with the library he's inherited from his father, and should think of it as the most glorious of the things in his house. When he encounters Cato in Lucullus's library, unexpectedly, Cicero is surprised to see him. Not because he's surprised to see a scholar in a library, but because he's surprised to see a scholar reading books in the library. Presumably there were so many, and Cato was so excited to see them that he didn't even take the time to bring them out. So they eventually both sit down there in the library rather than going to another place or outdoors, and they have a lengthy conversation, which is recorded fictionally for us by Cicero in the third book on the moral ends. Seneca, later on, speaks of people who spend lots of money on beautiful bindings of books and on cedar and ivory shelves, but don't care what's in their books. So I spoke about two cabinets in which books could be stored in the Tablinum. This is an imaginative reconstruction based on the description given by the excavators of one such cabinet. You can see here then the Papyrus rolls stacked on top of one another, basically, and each one with a little tag called a syllabus, that's the origin of our word, telling you what's in it. I also spoke about boxes of papyri, traveling boxes. So the excavation reports of Alcubierre indicate that the remains of 2 boxes of papyri were found, which appeared to the workers to be oblong mounds of earth, mud, and charcoal lumps. And alongside these mounds were found the remains of metal parts, hinges and handles. And these are Galavotti's reconstructions of the 2 rectangular capsae, or traveling boxes, in which 101 papyri were found. I'm guessing that the Latin papyri of the villa were in these traveling boxes, and also in another one that I'll show you in a second. And because then when people would leave to go hunting or go into the country or whatever, then they would take papyri with them. Well, the papyri they took with them were not the Epicurean philosophical books, but rather Latin papyri, so at least one of which is a poem, but many of which we don't really know what they were because they're too badly preserved. So this is the other kind of capsa, and this is in an ancient wall painting. And so you can see here, so a tablet showing presumably wax writing. And then this is the traveling box itself. It had a cover. The papyri were stuck into it end on. And it's made of leather, presumably, and could be carried on the shoulder of some slave who was accompanying the expedition. And now the clicker, there we go. So in the library room of the villa, room 5 on Weber's plan, were found bookshelves on all 4 sides, and a 2-sided reading table was put in the middle. The bookshelves in this room are said by the excavators to have been made of a variety of woods artistically combined, so intaglio and so on, and they were topped with cornices. This is a reconstruction of one niche of such a bookshelf, but not from Herculaneum, not from our villa, but rather from an excavation in Rome. But you can see here the way it goes. So you'd have this shelf here. It would be divided up into round niches by these columns, which are really very sweet. And then the name of the author of the book would be put below it. In this case, Apollonius of Tyana, the famous conjurer, I suppose you could say. Conjurer and guru. Maybe guru's better, actually. So the finds from the villa excavation were brought to the royal palace at Portici, which is right next door, where one wing was set up as the Museum Herculanense. It was at that museum that the early work on the papyri was done by Paderni, Piaggio, and others, not always to the best effect. In 1777, King Ferdinando decided to move his collections of antiquities, including the Museum Herculanense, to Naples, to occupy the Palazzo degli Studi, the Palace of Studies, which had previously housed the university, and that's why it has that name. That is now the Museo Archeologico Nazionale of Naples. The extended process of transferring the antiquities gave rise to this fanciful reimagining by Louis-Jean Desprez, engraved by Robert Daudet. So he imagined it all happening at once in a grand procession. This did not happen. But so many things didn't happen. We really want to be picky. When the papyrus rolls were first discovered, they were of little use to anyone. The first ones to be discovered at another site, at the villa of Poppaea in Oplontis, were burnt by workers in their home stoves because they felt that they were charcoal. And I suppose that's useful. Badly carbonized and extremely fragile, the rolls could not be opened and read, so they were less useful to scholars, except the cold ones. So these are the papyri that you can see upstairs, and you can see the condition in which they are currently. So this is the stick on which this papyrus roll was wound, and you can just make out that there are any number of layers rolled up here. And then this one is relatively well preserved. If you wanted to unroll this, which you may or may not be able to, then the first thing you would have to do is probably to take off some of this outer, what they sometimes refer to as a cortex or a bark, and then eventually find the place where the papyrus roll itself could begin to be unrolled. This one's pretty good. These are somewhat less good, as you can see. This one, you can see very well that it has a large number of windings, and you can also see the little stick, the umbilicus, in the middle. But it's only about 2 inches long, and so it's broken off from a larger part of the roll. It's probable, I suppose, that other part either is in similar condition, only longer, or it's a much larger pile of dust. Dust is a big factor in the papyri. At one point, when the papyri were hung on the walls of the library or of the museum, there was somebody paid entirely every day to go around and sweep up the papyrus dust that fell off them. Now, eventually the hero of our story will come to Naples, and that's Piaggio, Father Antonio Piaggio, and he then eventually had engraved some of his own drawings illustrating the conditions of the papyri which were given to him to work on. So here you have a broken one, sort of like the piece that we saw before. Here we have yet another one that's in pretty difficult condition, and one here as well. You can see this one's already, these are beginning to flake off in various ways, which is also not so good. And then here he's showing end position where you can see now the wooden rod or umbilicus on which this was wound, and so he's actually drawn that separately. And then here is the syllabus, so the label that was attached to this. Faced with such daunting lumps of coal, Papyri entertained various friends of the king, who gave suggestions and even made experiments on papyrus rolls. So one of them has become a famous object of, well, fascination or derision, I suppose. He was the Principe di San Severo, and he figured, smart guy, that quicksilver, liquid mercury, would slide effortlessly between the layers of papyrus. You've all had these little games where you have a little ball of mercury and you slide it around to put it through a maze. And you see how quickly it moves and how easily. So he thought that it would slide effortlessly between the layers of papyrus, allowing them to be separated. And so he built a box which would support a roll upright and allow him to pour mercury over it. Piaggio considered this as a part of Papyrni's butchery of the papyri. He uses that word, un macello. And he sketched it in his memorial of 1769. So here you have the baffles that would have held the roll upright. This is the papyrus roll itself. And then you have the open top by which to pour the mercury. Now this is an imaginative reconstruction of this experiment. I'm not quite sure why he's shown leaning his head away. I don't think mercury smells or anything, so. But anyway, you can see him pouring out the mercury into this hole in the top of the box. So this was done, the pouring of the mercury was done. The box was left for a time while the mercury would do its thing. When the box was opened, it's not that the birds began to sing, right? But the papyrus turned out to have been crushed to dust by the density of the mercury, which is a very high specific gravity. So, a non-starter. Soon Papyri, as, well, we could say curator, well, that was his title, as curator of the finds, began to take a knife to the rolls. And there's his knife. See? So he would take the knife to the rolls. He would cut them in half. And then he would use the butt end of the knife. So he was very efficient, right? So he used the sharp end of the knife and the butt end of the knife. The butt end of the knife, so he would hold the half of the papyrus in his hand. He would take the butt end, and he would pound it to crush the interior of the papyrus. And that he would then pour off into the toilet. Why? Well, because if you take the interior of the very interior of the papyrus, then it has a very small radius. And that means there are only a couple of letters visible. And Papyri didn't read Greek or anything like that, nor did the king. But the king, who was the only sovereign in Europe who owned papyrus rolls from antiquity, wanted to show them off. And he did. So this is the kind of process that we're talking about here. So, and we have it described by Papyrni's mortal enemy, Piaggio. So in his never-ceasing outrage against Papyri, Piaggio wrote, "Then, from the second wonderful and very abundant find, i.e. the first or all of the discoveries of 1754, he, Papyri, chose all those roundest and best turned in their shape, and whose material was of the best quality, things well known to him from the butchering of the first discovery. And before my very eyes, he put them aside for himself, shut himself in a room for a long time in the mornings and during the day, coming to the museum for this very purpose at dawn, and in the afternoon immediately after lunch, or else taking a rest, he would still work by lamplight in the evening. And with his Genoese knife in hand, he turned them at his leisure into so many little boats like those in Egypt." He would cut them first from top to toe, empty out their insides, and eviscerate enough of them to find a flat leaf, broader than the others, toward the outside of the roll, which was legible or interesting, according to the oracle of the above-mentioned Don Nicola Ignara, assistant and great professor of things Greek. Piaggio was very alive to the pretensions of some of the people he had to deal with. All the rest was reduced to powder and thrown into the toilet. These little boats did not see the light for a long time. Then, after the departure of the Catholic king, Il Re Cattolico, Charles VII of Bourbon's departure in 1759 to become Charles III of Spain, no fewer than 14 boxes of these little boats were brought out, and these are currently on display to be shown to foreigners. And thereby, I'm not sure whether the shamelessness in his face or the ignominy of such a great museum is the greater. Among those fragments, there is one which was recently given to me so that I could imitate its writing and engrave it in copperplate, which I did as well as my artistry and industry allowed. Such a humble man. So this here, you'd have to imagine this black or dark brown. But this is an end-on view of a papier-mâché model of a papyrus roll made by our next speaker, Richard Janko, showing the cuts made into each side of the roll, so here and here, and the uncut middle referred to as the marrow or midollo. Here's a top view of the same piece, just so you get an idea of what this process might have looked like. And then a schematic sort of drawing of it. So this was the result when eventually, either because he was tired of scraping out the insides of his rolls, or as Piaggio suggests, because he had trouble cutting all the way through them, Paderni would cut in on opposite sides of a roll, then pull off two of what Piaggio referred to as barche, or Egyptian boats, leaving the central core intact. So we take the whole roll, we cut in on both sides, pull off these two shells, or sometimes they didn't seem to want to come off together, and so you'd cut them in half. And then you have also left over the middle part. You can see that on Richard's model as well. And here's another. So as you can see, on the interior of this, there would have been writing, so the column of writing of the papyrus. And eventually, this could be copied and then scraped off, and then the layer underneath it could also be copied. So in that process, especially beginning in the 1820s, when they were running out of rolls that they could unroll easily, the personnel of the officina, who always needed work because they always needed to be paid, they took the multi-layered outer fragments to work on. And they would draw the innermost layer, then scrape it off to reveal the layer underneath it, draw it in turn, and then scrape it off, until what remained was a thin piece at the outside, which they thought wouldn't be able to be scraped any further. And that would then be drawn and mounted on thick paper for preservation. And here's such a last leaf, as they call them, ultimo folio, from near the beginning of Philodemus's book on Rhetoric, book 4. And it is upstairs in the Villa exhibition right now, so you can examine it more closely. Here is the Neapolitan drawing. That's this one here on this side, on the left. Sorry, you're right. Here's the Neapolitan drawing of that last leaf, fragment 7 out of 7, alongside the layer which was above it, fragment 6 of 7, until that layer was scraped away to reveal the last one. Although fragment 7 on the left was drawn with artificially straight sides to mimic the margins of this column, which is preserved in its full length, while it's full line length, while fragment 6 on the right was drawn with its actual uneven sides, it's easy to see that the shapes are the same, as is the damage in the middle of the bottom, down here. And so these were directly one on top of the other, and that much should be obvious. So here are the residua, or some of the residua, of Paderni's method, which were illustrated along with sketches of whole papyri on the bottom in Andrea de Iorio's 1825 guidebook to the Officina dei Papyri. In 1753 already, Giuseppe alZaman, who was keeper and expert on early Christian manuscripts at the Vatican Library, and also by royal appointment chronicler of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in Naples, convinced the king to request that the Vatican send someone to assist with the unrolling of the papyri. And for that job, he already had someone in mind, namely the Genoese father Antonio Piaggio delle Scuole Pie, whom he recommended as the only man alive who could succeed in the task. A distinguished and ingenious restorer of illuminated manuscripts in the Vatican Library, as well as papal scribe, Piaggio arrived in Naples in early July of 1753, at first for a short time, and then he got an extension, namely for the rest of his life. He arrived in Naples, where the curator Camillo Paderni made clear to him that he was unwelcome. Piaggio became the hero of the early history of the papyri, and this portrait by Achille Giovanni was hung in the museum by royal command of Ferdinando II of Bourbon on the 12th of May, 1854. Piaggio himself, in a memorial that he wrote later on, illustrated the conditions in which he found papyri after the depredations of Paderni. So here we see a closed book roll, another already opening by itself. So that's here, then here. And then a central wrong button. A central midollo, or central portion, and then a piece from an outer half cylinder or a Egyptian boat. And then in the bottom row, we have the innermost layers of some pieces of this bark from the outside of the papyrus roll. And they are just in fragments. So opposed to the summoning of help from the Vatican, Paderni gave Piaggio the task of working on the central portions of the rolls he had cut open. Paderni considered these cylinders useless, since they would yield only a small surface of writing if they were cut open the way he had done with other whole rolls. He kept them in a box of his own design, we're told, derisively called La Casa Magica, so the magician's chest, by Piaggio, who illustrated it here in his memorial of 1769. So this was thought by Paderni to be safe for Piaggio. Give him an impossible job, keep him out of your hair. Piaggio then turned around, and having decided that picking pieces off the outside of this was no better than what Paderni had been doing and was destroying them, he decided to try to unroll them whole. And so he invented his famous Machina, a machine which allowed him to unroll the midolli, at least some of the best of them, continuously. So this is probably the first version of his Machina. You can see a late version of it, which I'll also show you a picture of upstairs. And so you've got a little carriage here to hold the papyrus roll, which is then also supported by bands here. And then it's attached by silk threads here, and then ultimately will be drawn up into a slit in this top piece onto a rod of wood and wound backwards on that rod. And here you have a drawing again of Piaggio at work on his machine. And you can see he's got a number of other rolls below here, which are in a box very much like the one in which they were found first. So when the papyrus finished unrolling on the first versions of Piaggio's machine, it was rolled up backwards on the rod at the top. It was then taken off and stored in that condition. And in fact, it was stored, the very first one that he unrolled, he cut up into pieces so that it could be displayed in crystal frames to the king's friends. But after that, he kept them in this condition, and they were kept that way until at least 1802. So this is again a drawing of the top view of that version of Piaggio's machine. You can see something about what this would look like if it was unrolled continuously, because this is the fifth papyrus unrolled by Piaggio. It's a copy of one of the books of Philodemus on vices, namely on flattery. You didn't know flattery was a vice, did you? And you can see that Maleschi, one of the drawers, the draftsman here, has now drawn it in its entirety, column after column, until the very end where you have, so the book ends, there's a little bit of empty space, and then the title, Philodemu, Peri Kakion, and so on. And Piaggio himself drew two drawings of the last columns in 1761 to 62, but the whole papyrus was still stored on a stick in 1782 when Piaggio's inventory was made, and Maleschi drew it as he saw it, one continuous length of papyrus. Later versions of Piaggio's machine drew the leading edge of the papyrus up using silk threads attached to knurled screws. Each time it reached the top of the frame, it was cut with a sharp knife, drawn, and stored. This is the machine as you'll see it upstairs. Now that we've seen something of attempts to open papyri, let's go back in time a bit. Father Piaggio died in 1796, having opened 17 papyri together with his assistant, Merli. In 1798, the royal family took shelter in its second capital, Palermo, to escape the Jacobins of the Parthenopean Revolution, at least one of whom was Pasquale Baffi, professor of Greek paleography, who was working to edit 4 Herculaneum Papyri. The papyri were shipped off to accompany the king. However, the boxes in which they were sent off were never opened, and as the revolution had been put down in 1799 and its leaders hanged in the marketplace, the boxes of papyri were returned to Baiae in January of 1802. Their return was awaited at Portici by John Hayter, 1756 to 1818, the canon in ordinary to the Prince Regent of Great Britain, who was granted permission to organize anew the work of the Officina dei Papiri and financed to do so by the Prince Regent. Hayter worked in Portici from January of 1802 until the imminent arrival of Napoleon's army in February 1806. After reluctantly allowing a chemist, Gaetano Lapira, to experiment on some papyrus fragments with what he called vegetable gas, which atomized them, Hayter set to work himself. He learned from 3 of Piaggio's workers the art of unfolding the book rolls. Then he took on 10 new men, including 2 draftsmen, and he put the spurs to the workings of the officina, assigning both an unroller and a draftsman to each roll to be unrolled. Hayter selected rolls for unrolling. Whenever the small brush, which they wetted and applied, in this case, to the outside surface of the manuscript, caused the exterior fold to raise itself singly in a detached state from the next layer under it, that manuscript most completely justified the experiment, however simple, by a more entire separation of each fold in the volume, especially from the middle part. This is quoting Hayter. And that worked even to the end, and it was also justified by a more entire preservation of letters both in form and in color. Such promising rolls could then be fastened with silk threads to the machine of Piaggio and unrolled by tightening the threads very gradually, while loosening the outermost layer of papyrus with a fine needle and supporting the material where it was weak by gluing gold beater's skin to the back of it. Each segment of papyrus was then given to the draftsman to copy. The draftsman drawing was checked by an academic who knew Greek, and a fee of 1 carlino was recorded as payment to both the unroller and the copyist for each complete line correctly transcribed. Since Hayter paid each man a monthly salary that he knew was wholly inadequate to live on, each one had an incentive to complete as much as they could and also to push their partner to greater achievement. Then the drawing was assigned to an engraver who made the copper plates, which would eventually be printed when the papyrus was published. Under Hayter's direction, the officina unrolled over 200 book roll cores in less than 4 years, which is rather an increase over the 17 unrolled in the 44 years of the officina's first incarnation. Once Hayter went off to Palermo, he got into a spot of difficulty with the local authorities, something to do with a rather young novice nun found in his hotel room. And persona non grata had to return to England. Despite the relative success of Piaggio's machine, in the early 19th century, others thought they could improve on the method. One such was the Thuringian ancient historian Friedrich Karl Ludwig Sickler, who offered his services to unroll the papyri which had been given to the Prince Regent, the future King George IV, using a new method. It's sometimes said that that the Prince Regent received 18 papyri in exchange for 18 kangaroos. So, Sickler had the idea of making an unrolling machine similar to that of Piaggio, but he destroyed everything he touched, 7 of them. So, and then further experiments were made by Sir Humphrey Davy, who was a real chemist, and his experiments with nitrous oxide had brought him great notoriety and started a party fad in England of the early 19th century. Here we have a lecture by him and a demonstration on nitrous oxide. His experiments with papyri were partially successful, but again, you can see that multiple layers, this is one layer, this is another layer, and so the text is interrupted. But they disturbed the results of this, and that became something of a problem. Here's another one, Latin text. So after Piaggio's death, a papyrus unrolled by Piaggio and left on the stick onto which it had been wound in reverse atop the machine would be taken off the stick and cut like this one, the third papyrus unrolled by Piaggio, into pieces of 4 to 6 columns in width, so as to be more manageable to work on and to store. On the later version of the machine, the papyrus had to be cut by the man unrolling it when it reached the top of the machine's frame. So here is one column out of that piece of papyrus. And then, since we're talking about readers and reading of the papyri, this is the first drawing of this papyrus column, one of 2 preserved copies of the second book of Philodemus' Rhetoric, and the third papyrus opened by Piaggio with his machine. This drawing was among those in the hands of Pasquale Baffi when he was executed for his role in the Neapolitan Revolution in 1799. It was returned to the museum in 1808 when a pension was granted to his widow. This is the second copy of that papyrus. It was drawn under Hayter's direction, and then eventually brought to Oxford University, where it still resides. And then those columns, those drawings in Oxford were then published in Oxford in 1825. In the meantime, when the Officina dei Papyri was reorganized again during the rule of Napoleon's man Murat in 1807, under the leadership of Monsignor Rosini, Archbishop of Pozzuoli, one of the first tasks was to redo the drawings that had been taken away to England, a task accomplished by the disegnatori alongside their usual work of opening and drawing new book rolls. Then they were given to academici, So academics who knew Greek and tried to make an edition. As you can see, this is rather rough work. This is a somewhat less rough edition. Alongside a Latin translation, there was also a commentary on this. In the meantime, some Neapolitan drawings were engraved and published. And this is the first column of the first one published in 1793. This book, which is owned by the Getty, a copy of which is owned by the Getty, is upstairs in the exhibition. You can see, I think, this very page. Then it was published here. You can see the way the conscientious editor put in the things that were not visible in the papyrus in red, and then some things that were really not visible in the papyrus he put in as dots, and then he made a Latin translation alongside it. Eventually, after 1860, so starting in 1862, all the copper plates that had been made that weren't published because the work went so slowly were published all together in a series of another 11 volumes. Here's a modern edition of this very column. Some other pieces, so the little Egyptian boats then would have been drawn in this way, and some of them were then mounted here. You can see that some of these obviously belong together, but some of them don't. This one, for example, this is quite different. So retracing the story of the pieces in this frame is rather complicated, and we won't be able to go into it all. But this was mounted in one so as one fragment, but the top part and the bottom part actually belong to two entirely different books. This is a piece of Philodemus's Rhetoric. This is a piece of Philodemus on music. And this one is also drawn under another papyrus number. So this is the drawing made of the column from which the top of the previous picture is all that survives. So like the philosophy which created the book rolls, their unrolling was a collaborative process. One man was assigned to operate the unrolling machine, another to draw each column as it came off the machine, a third man supposed to examine the drawing, comparing it with the original. The drawing was then given to a fourth man, whose job it was to transfer the drawing to copperplate so that it could be published. And yet another man, sometimes two, also checked the first prints made from the copperplates to see whether everything had been done accurately. This is another drawing, and then the first proof sheet of the copper plate from that drawing. And you can see the corrections that have been made here. Some of them conjectural, that is, did this really say RI, or did this one really say R? It's not clear. Reading was still an individual occupation, though, and it still is, although the work of constructing a text is so difficult that we often call on friends to lend an eye or to lend an opinion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we go right to that one. Thank you so much, David, for that thorough survey of the earliest reading. Our next speaker, Richard Janko, will bring us up to the present day. He is Gerald F. Elst Distinguished University Professor of Classical Studies at the University of Michigan and at Ann Arbor. Professor Janko has previously taught at University College London, UCLA, Columbia, St. Andrews, and Cambridge University, where he received his doctorate. He is the author of 9 books with several others in press and well over 100 articles and scholarly reviews. Professor Janko is not only a renowned philologist and papyrologist, but also an expert in Aegean prehistory, in Homer, and the history of criticism. Among his many, many awards, I mention only a few. He was elected a foreign member of the Academy of Athens in 2017, has held Fulbright, Guggenheim, and Institute of Advanced Study grants, is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, winner of the American Philological Association's Goodwin Award for Merit, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Please join me in welcoming Professor Richard Janko to the Getty Villa.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to you all for being here. I'll move through briskly. So in 1955, J. Paul Getty, fluent in many languages, as was essential, in fact, to his success in business, and well-versed in the literature of ancient Greece and Rome, published a novella entitled A Journey from Corinth in his book, A Collector's Choice, which he wrote jointly with Ethel Levane. And in this story, Getty imagined a Greek architect, a certain Glaucus of Corinth, advising one of the richest nobles in Rome, Piso, on how to build a great villa on the romantic Bay of Naples and how to fill it with the finest bronze sculptures from his homeland. Mr. Getty, unlike most of us, had the resources both to fulfill his fantasy and to share it with us, as our presence here attests. And it's just wonderful to see all this amazing exhibit finally in, well, a replica of the place where it was found. He would have been very happy indeed about today's event. He certainly knew that Piso's summer residence at Herculaneum, the Villa dei Papyri, contained not only priceless bronzes, but also the only library from classical antiquity that was buried in conditions that assured its preservation. The library was found between 1752 and 1754. It consists entirely of books that were otherwise lost. And a contemporary, Paderni, whom we heard about, tells us that about 800 rolls were found. This number's been hard to confirm, but is likely to be right. And based on David's hypothesis about the 100 books in the cases being the Latin ones, we probably had around 700 scrolls originally in this find. There was no catalogue of these books until they could be opened. Nobody had any idea what they might contain. And almost 300 scrolls or parts of scrolls are still waiting for that day. Some of the papyri were found outside in the garden, others in the Tablinum or nearby, or in the inner peristyle, and you can have great fun rediscovering these fine spots, so-called, within the ground plan of the Getty Villa, and there's the Tablinum, whose role David eloquently explained. The most intriguing find spot was, of course, the library, room number 5, the small room with shelves like a set of open mailboxes on which papyrus rolls were piled up in triangular piles. This was the actual storeroom for the books. Nearby, there were small busts like that of Epicurus, indicating which authors were on that particular shelf. And Cicero tells us at one point that he studied under a bust of Aristotle in one of the Roman libraries in the Bay. We can even tell which way round some of the papyri lay on their shelves. The roll that I'm now publishing, which I'll show you later, is much harder to read in its bottom 3 or 4 lines, because that end of it was pointing outwards on the shelf and was darkened by 10,000 ancient suns. Another intriguing feature of the villa, marked on my plan up here, is a room with a semicircular array of perhaps 50 to 100 seats, entered from a wide lobby with 3 doors in front. I'm not sure whether anyone has noted its significance. I suspect that it was a lecture room. If the villa contained a lecture room located not far from the library, we're surely entitled to wonder whether the villa contained even more books than those that have already been recovered. As you know, there were books in Latin as well, like this major Roman epic about the Battle of Actium and the death of Cleopatra, which was in at least 9 books, 9 book rolls. And I identified some new fragments of this among old drawings in Oxford a few years back. The Latin papyri remain underexplored, but most of the books are, of course, in Greek. The nucleus of this collection was assembled elsewhere, probably in Athens. The oldest books that are in it were actually quite old. They go back almost to the lifetime of the philosopher Epicurus, to no later than about 260 BCE, as the handwriting of a few volumes reveals. They still have the epigraphic form of omega. There are numerous works by the followers of Epicurus, and the manuscript on the left, we can tell from the, even from this drawing, was written in the mid to late 3rd century BCE, as the handwriting proves. One of the more amusing items in the collection is the book, of which the title was recently found, by Zeno of Sidon, in reply to Craterus's essay against Zeno's essay on geometrical proofs. And this has a good claim to be the first reply to a hostile book review, something you get in the New York Times every Sunday. Most of the collection, though, consists of the works by Philodemus. Philodemus was the teacher, as we heard, of Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, and he also influenced Horace, as my current project actually confirms. The Philosophical Library was, I believe, Philodemus's own personal collection, and it includes one item, a copy of his History of Plato's Academy, with additional paragraphs written on the back of the roll. Clearly an author's draft, even if the handwriting is that of an amanuensis rather than of the author himself. This is suggestive that Piso once owned the villa himself, and that the manuscripts were still there during the eruption because his descendants owned the villa. If you're wondering how I got interested in this when I started out as an archaeologist, in 1984 I published a controversial book where I argued that a summary of the lost book of Aristotle's Poetics, about which Umberto Eco, coincidentally at the same time, wrote his book, his novel, The Name of the Rose, still existed in a manuscript in Paris. Soon afterwards, I heard that a Herculaneum papyrus containing a discussion of Aristotle's Poetics existed, and I went to Naples to investigate. And when I got there, I found that the claim was partly true, and that there were huge numbers of papyri still sitting there, which were unpublished because they were so hard to read. At that time, the only microscopes used light reflected from the sun. You remember, well, you don't remember, most of you, that kind of microscope. Because the ink is black and the background is black, you could see the letters only by tilting the papyrus in the light so that it would fall across them. But of course, the head of the microscope and your own head obscured nearly everything within its own shadow. Undaunted, I went to work and have subsequently published 4 papyrus rolls from the collection. This may not sound like very much, but wait till you hear what effort it takes to reconstruct and to publish them. The conditions greatly improved in 1995 when the first microscopes with a light around the lens arrived. A simple innovation, but there it is. Even now, of course, you still see only a few letters at a time. Fewer than those, probably slightly more than that. It's very hard to find where you are in the text, and I spend most of my time there losing my place and finding it. But this work is the most intellectually challenging thing I've ever done. It even beats publishing an archaeological site. In 1999, a team from Brigham Young University, led by Steve Boris, imaged the whole collection in ultraviolet light using technology that NASA developed for viewing distant and very dark planets. And at last, we had images that could be studied away from Naples. This one shows a piece from the book of Philodemus on the nature of poetry that I'm now publishing. Its title is on its conjectural title is On Poems 2. The papyrus of On Poems 2 was originally 17 yards long. I thought about bringing the model, but I don't think this room would be large enough to unroll it. It contained 222 columns. This is the only time I came close to occupying a house where there was a table large enough to unroll the model. But even so, it was in 2 goes. And the end of it is there, and it fell on the floor and then came up again like this, and then there was more of it on the floor the other side. But the making a model was actually very important to facilitate its reconstruction. This was not my house, of course. I put the roll back together by combining all the broken pieces that are in the same distinctive handwriting called Hand 8. And luckily, this is the only manuscript in Hand 8. The next step was to measure the circumferences of each piece after finding the ones in the same handwriting, because, of course, the circumferences get smaller towards the middle of the roll, and this greatly helps one to place them. And 6 different papyri with different numbers make up On Poems 2, the outside of which was cut off in order to open it. And you can see, of course, that the outer pieces were removed first. Archival research tells us, but by Piaggio and his assistant, before 1763, the middle part was one of the pieces. Why is this not working? I have my own. One of the pieces. Oh, no, that's not working either. Where's my stick? That would do. The circumferences get smaller, and the ones in the middle were unrolled by Piaggio and his assistant. Oh, yes, there we go. In 1763-5, and then the final bit was unrolled by Hayter in 1802. And one has to do quite a bit of work in the archives to verify the dates, but it's fun. We owe this papyrus to Piaggio himself. The outer parts, as I said, were cut off into stacks of fragments, leaving this roll in the middle. Scholars then published these fragments, but they published them in backwards order, not understanding that it was first the innermost one, which is nearest to the end of the roll. It was only in the mid-1980s that the French scholar Daniel Delattre understood that you have to interleave pieces from the 2 sides of the roll and arrange them in alternating backwards order to reconstruct the outer parts. The surface of the papyrus is not flat. The folds were burned into it by the volcano, and to flatten it is to destroy it. And parts of different layers are often visible at the same time. You can see the ink here does not marry up with the ink here. This phenomenon can be deeply misleading. So in working on these, I found it essential not only, of course, to use the multispectral images from Brigham Young, but also to make my own drawing. I start off by copying these images, but then I have to annotate my own notebook on squared paper, recording the transitions between the layers. An example of how the images are misleading are these little black dots, which are actually holes, not ink. So I note the empty margins and many other details as I go along, and I use notebooks because loose leaves get lost. The problem of the two-dimensional nature of the images is being solved by using reflectance transformation imaging, where you take many photographs of the papyrus, of the piece of papyrus from different angles, and combine them together digitally. But the files are immense and they are not stable. And it's very, very time-consuming to make these images. The whole collection needs to be imaged that way. But studying the original remains absolutely indispensable. One has to measure the circumferences very accurately in order to establish where in the roll the fragments belong. So here's some typical notes on those measurements. And in On Poems 2, I had the luck that Philodemus rebuts arguments that he had already summarized in On Poems Book 1, which I reconstructed with a fair level of success and brought out in 2002. So I was able to establish a series of verbal parallels between Book 1 on the left and Book 2 on the right, and these are the words that actually overlap. And then down here I have the circumferences, so you can see that the order corresponds, with the circumferences reducing from 15.9 to 12.5 in this particular part of the table. I was also able to study the sheets from which each papyrus roll is glued together. And as these sheets are of fairly similar length, they serve as a check on the other methods of reconstruction. The papyrus turns out to contain exactly 100 sheets. It was at first 70 sheets, and then a further 30 sheets, which were copied separately, were glued on afterwards. And this is actually that join. It's cut to follow the margin, obeying what papyrologists called Mars's law. So we know this is a secondary join. The text is very hard to get right. First, you have to read it, which is not easy, even where it's well preserved. Of course, it's all in capitals, like certain presidential tweets. And also, there are no spaces between the words. He hasn't got to that yet. Squared paper, a pencil, and an eraser are the high-tech essentials for this work. The eraser is more important than the pencil. I prepare the drawings from the photographs, and I annotate them in presence of the original, and I do it about 4 times. So you can see there what a bad draftsman I am. The word division in Greek has very strict rules, and they help with the reconstruction. At the right-hand side of the lines, you need to count the letters to avoid mistakes in filling in the holes. And the scribes actually were very careful to justify the right-hand side of the column. You can see they even crowd the letters along the right-hand side. The images can be studied at very high magnification on big screens, and the scribe also, this particular scribe has more punctuation than any other ancient scribe that I know, which actually helps one read the text. It's faint, it's in a different, lighter ink, added afterwards, I think. One obviously has a lot of holes in the papyrus, but you can use electronic databases like the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae or the online Liddell and Scott to help one find missing words. I check printouts of my draft against the original so that I make sure I verify each difficult letter. And my first readings and supplements are normally wrong. Here I thought this said proterois. It actually says photerois, so it's definitely not proterois. It takes patience and persistence to read the traces right, even before the holes get filled in, when they can be filled in, and that is far from invariably the case. So here's a quick example of how the text gets improved. Francesco Sbordone in 1976 was the first person to try to edit most of these papyri. Gompertz had done some in 1891, but not very much. And one particular column that I'm going to show you, this was all of it that Sbordone read, and just a few letters. And this is my first drawing of this, and you can see already that this is a row and not a phi, but that's based on the photograph. In my printout of 2009, I'd identified a parallel with Book 1, where Philodemus quotes from Homer's Iliad, and I therefore was able to fill in quite a bit more. Here are these letters shown in the edition of Book 1. So you can see that finally I managed to combine these two fragments, which are actually in different cut segments, but displaced by the multiple layers. I actually was able to combine them into a text. So instead of saying proterois, this says amphoterois, just there. Oh dear, this thing is doing other things than it should. So amphoterois, that meaning both instead of previous. This is the result, and you can see these are two different segments of papyrus, Cornice 11, as they call it, and Cornice 10. These were hung in different framed segments on the walls of the museum until the 1860s. And here's the present state of this papyrus as it will appear in January in the publication of Book 2. And I got a whole lot out of this paragraph. It's actually completely coherent. The work is like putting together a mosaic. It's truly fascinating and absorbing. You have to be very patient. It takes a while, but one gets there in the end, like the snail crossing the brick. Meanwhile, I get immense pleasure from recovering the thoughts of the ancients in their actual words. On Poems 2, as I said, amounts to 222 columns of text. I think I'm currently editing the proof of page 500 and something, and I'm not quite at the end. Much of it is surprisingly complete. This passage is about whether birds can talk. So we've got swallows and parrots and nightingales here. I'm still understanding it a little bit more. Even in the proof stage, I'm having to make a few changes. There are large chunks at the very end which are extremely complete. This puts together two different columns, 210, 211. And here Philodemus is reporting the views of an unknown, hitherto unknown critic called Pausimachus on how you need to mix vowels and consonants to make a poem sound better. He actually has a whole hierarchy of vowels and consonants. R is the most euphonious, E is considerably worse, of course among the consonants, L is wonderful, and M and N are quite sonorant as well, whereas those pesky stops really are a bother, and you don't want to have too many T's and P's and things like that. And the worst things of all are the aspirates, PH and TH. Well, no, I forgot. The worst of all is S. It's a very interesting theory. This man was a musician, musical theorist, and Philodemus doesn't believe a word he says, but he does report it. We badly need more well-qualified people to work on the papyri because new techniques and new technologies are constantly making it easier to do that, and there is a lot to do. But I think we shouldn't leave the other books that undoubtedly remain in the unexplored areas of the villa at the mercy of the next eruption by Vesuvius. There hangs in my office in Michigan, by coincidence, this map, a map of 1908 showing recent lava flows from the top of the mountain. The villa is over here in the lava flows of the 1630s. Nothing flowed over it since then, but in geological time, that's not very long. There is not time to be lost if we are to get more books out. So thank you very much.
Thank you so very, very much, Richard. So now, as we do a quick technical changeover, you have a sense of yesterday and today, how much effort has been put into trying to recover the scrolls, read them, understand them, the mistakes, the corrections, the perseverance, the patience, the sheer brain power applied to this. Our third speaker, I'm pleased to introduce Brent Seales, Distinguished Alumni Professor and Chair of Computer Science at the University of Kentucky, founder of the Center for Visualization and Director of the Digital Restoration Initiative. A graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a former visiting scientist at Google, he is, since earlier this month, a fellow in residence at the Getty Conservation Institute here in Los Angeles. His groundbreaking work, I think many of you have seen featured on 60 Minutes, the BBC, and numerous other news outlets. He has recently received major awards for the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Mellon Foundation for the digital restoration of the Herculaneum Papyri. I am extremely grateful to him and his team from the University of Kentucky, as I am to our previous two speakers, for their contributions to the exhibition, to its catalog, to Brent and his team for their generous help in mounting the exhibition and in producing our in-gallery video, which many of you have seen, which is also on the exhibition website. Please welcome to the podium Dr. Brent Seales.
Does anybody know my password? I think I remember it. Thank you very much, Ken, for the introduction. I have the pleasure of taking up the last spot, standing in between you and the drinks we were going to have in the plaza. So I'm not going to talk about how I became interested in this, although you will see some history, but a good story might be that I answered a cry for help from the therapists that these men invariably have to visit in the work that they do. I recently did move to California, and I'll tell you that I was a little bit surprised at the traffic, although, you know, we do have traffic in Kentucky. But I haven't seen any of the slow-moving vehicle signs on the 405. I also am astounded at the beauty of the misty morning, and you know, in Kentucky we also have. Yes. But I'm eager to be closer to some of the best wines in America and the world, and I would just like to invite you all to come and taste some of Kentucky's wines. So let me begin by doing something that computer scientists do, which is to start recursively, and that is to take yesterday, today, and tomorrow and divide it again into yesterday, today, and tomorrow for my talk. But I will make that interval be much shorter because I'm a computer scientist. What you're seeing here is the first experiment that I did on the idea of virtual unwrapping. And on the left, you'll see the machine I used to scan a proxy that I made, and on the right, you'll see the data that I acquired from that machine. This was a medical-grade CT scanner in the basement of the hospital at the University of Kentucky. And what we did with this data was that we were able to figure out how to see the inside of something without opening it, and use software after the scanning to be able to unfurl the geometry of what was inside to recover the writing without any physical restoration. This is dependent on software, on scanning, on physics, on geometry, and as you heard from before, geometry might be something we could help with. It turns out there are some things in the history of Herculaneum that could actually use an engineer and a computer scientist. And so as I got interested in this area, I realized that a collaborative approach with an idea like virtual unwrapping could end up providing a very fruitful approach. A second experiment here shows the proxy that I made actually on papyrus this time. And on the right, the data from a more detailed CT scanner, which becomes then the basis for the process of virtual unwrapping. And from that data alone, it's possible to produce a reading on the top from the photograph from the data on the bottom that you're seeing in loop, and the photograph for comparison, basically showing in these early examples the possibility of virtual unwrapping and the promise of that idea for something like Herculaneum. Now, you have to understand the timeline here. Yesterday, today, tomorrow. If we take the 2,000 years of Herculaneum history and cut it in half, and as a computer scientist, I will round off the authorship date of Beowulf to about 1,000, okay? And we cut that in half again. Again, a binary tree, computer science, 500, 250, 125. We have Vesuvius, 5 levels deep in the binary subdivision of the 2,000-year interval. On the right-hand side, you do the same, and all of that becomes yesterday. And what becomes today is since the BlackBerry. Or for those of you who don't remember the BlackBerry, the first iPhone in 2006-07 is the yesterday that I'm talking about. Now, at the time that I was doing work with antiquities and the subject of Herculaneum came up, I was actually working with full manuscripts and the idea of imaging those manuscripts. It was due to a gentleman who actually preceded me that I became educated about Herculaneum and the beauty of these damaged things. In 2005, Richard Janko actually took me personally to Herculaneum, and he allowed me to enter with him at the library, and he showed me these scrolls and also the officina, where the work by gentlemen like David and Richard happens. And it was then and only then that I became educated about the amazing damage that had been done and also the promise of virtual unwrapping, if it could be realized, on a collection as valuable and precious as Herculaneum. We took photos. We began to think about how we might convert the proxy examples that we had done into something that could actually approach the complexity of Herculaneum, and I began to conceive of this idea of moving away from Piaggio's machine in the physical idea and moving toward something that could be done completely virtually. We began that work in 2005, and in 2009 we were able finally to take a real, authentic Herculaneum scroll, put it in a scanner, and collect data. And you're seeing video from that era. The Institut de France has 6 scrolls, 2 of which are intact. And through their collaboration and with the help of Monsieur Daniel Delattre, we were able to make a computed tomography image, which is a 3-dimensional scan of everything inside 2 intact scrolls. And this is the first radiograph that was ever produced from that work in 2009. You'll see the container on the outside, the bulk of the scroll in the middle, and you see the rubber band across the top, which was the closure mechanism to hold the case together. You look at the inside of the scroll, and what you can see is the first ever look at the tortured internal structure of a Herculaneum scroll, but one that hasn't yet been completely dismantled by well-meaning people pouring mercury or using gas, or from Kentucky we might say a Bowie knife, for lack of a better term, to be able to open. So we were able actually to do this work completely non-invasively, and while we struggled at being able to read the writing, this was a huge contribution and step forward, because although our examples, as in the lower right, were simplified compared to the true structure of Herculaneum, the approach was something that was becoming a possibility, a dream for me, and a real ability for the community. So here's some data from that early experiment to show you the idea of the scan and the data that it produced, to be able to see every layer from tomography all the way through the structure of the scroll, and then to be able to unwrap a section of that virtually without any need to open the object physically. And then you can see on the result here the striations of the actual papyrus intact from the internal part of the scroll. No writing visible, although if you stare at it long enough, you might convince yourself that you are seeing writing, and I'll speak to that in a minute. So this is what we were faced with in 2009. Internal structure never before seen, promise of the possibility of virtual unwrapping, and the development of a technical approach which I began to call an engine for discovery, made up of a series of software approaches that at the beginning would be based on something like tomography, and at the end would allow scholarship. If you want to consider that to be transparent, basically a new way to take a picture and the ability then to read what came out. I want to give you some intuition, though, into this, because tomography is difficult to understand if you haven't seen it before. So let me play for you a short video to give you some intuition.
Imagine for a moment that a baker has two types of dough. The white dough represents papyrus, and the red dough represents ink. Using the red dough, the baker can create a pi symbol on the white dough. When the baker rolls up the dough, the pi symbol is obviously no longer visible, just like when papyrus is rolled up. Imagine the effects of time and the environment are this evident, baking the pastry for 1,000 years. If the pastry were still soft, the baker could simply unroll it, but now it would break and the information would be lost. The baker can, however, slice the pastry and decode the message from the traces of red dough in each slice.
This is where everything crashes. I'm not sure where the audio went, but we take the slices, put them together, and you see the image on the right. And that image comes from those slices photographed end-on, which is just like tomography. That's not ever possible, that physical unwrapping, but the virtual is possible and gives a reading. Does that give you kind of an intuition that this is the jelly roll model? Yeah? All right, well, while we struggled with Herculaneum, and we have struggled mightily, it's one of the most difficult problems we've ever faced. What came along was another scroll ready to go, and this scroll from the Dead Sea on the western shore from En-Gedi was ready-made for us to try virtual unwrapping, and in fact, it succeeded. And some of you may have seen this work. The scroll from En-Gedi was virtually unwrapped in 2015 and appeared in publication in 2016. And I want to show you another video that looks exactly like the one I just showed, except with a real scroll, the scroll from En-Gedi.
Virtual unwrapping begins by acquiring a three-dimensional volumetric scan of the damaged manuscript. This scan produces a set of cross-sectional images that show the internal structure of the scroll. When viewed as a 3D object, one can clearly see the individual layers of the scroll, but any text on the surface of those layers is obscured from view. In order for a readable version of the scroll to be produced, these images must be passed through our virtual unwrapping pipeline. First, we capture the 3D shape of the layers of the scroll in a process called segmentation. On the left side of the screen, the software moves through the scroll, image by image, tracing the shape of a single scroll wrap. On the right, we see the 3D model that this produces. Next, we extract the ink from the data in a process called texturing. Using the 3D shape generated by segmentation, our software makes another pass through the scroll, this time looking for very bright pixels. Bright pixels indicate regions of dense material, in this case, inks made with iron or lead. We now have a single wrap of the scroll with the text shown clearly on its surface. However, because the surface is curved, it's difficult to read all of the text from one viewpoint. The flattening stage of our pipeline converts this textured 3D surface into a flat plane so that the text can be more easily read. To produce the best results, these 3 steps must be performed on one small section of the scroll at a time. As a result, we end up with several texture images that must be merged together. This merging process creates a single consolidated image that shows the full text. Using this pipeline, we have restored and revealed the text of 5 complete wraps of the Getty scroll. The 2 distinct columns of Hebrew writing reveal the scroll to be the book of Leviticus. This marks the Getty scroll as the earliest copy of a Pentateuchal book ever found in a holy ark, a significant discovery in biblical archaeology.
Thanks to my daughter who did the voiceover. My daughter Julia lives here in LA, and it's wonderful that I'm here to be able to see her a little bit more. And I want to tell you that sometimes you catch a break. The break that we caught here with the Getty scroll was that, number one, the ink didn't require any further processing from the tomography to be able to see it. And number two, the wraps were not so tight, so we didn't have to solve a really difficult problem of finding all those wraps. Everything else in the pipeline worked, and we were able to go from acquisition through all the stages to scholarship. We actually published a paper from scholars who did biblical scholarship on that text. Biblical scholarship on that text from the internal part of the scroll, never having opened it. So now what I want to show you are some problems with Herculaneum, and I'm going to tell you how we're going to solve them. These are not real letters. And I'm not going to ask our papyrologists to tell me which Greek letters or Latin letters these are, because they're not real. These are examples that I've snipped from my own data from Herculaneum to show that it's possible to see letter forms, even though they're not examples of real letter forms. We have to include, when we talk about virtual unwrapping, a metadata pipeline from the original data to the final claim. And if we don't make that pipeline available for peer review, then it's possible for people to imagine that they're seeing writing inside something as difficult and complicated as X-ray, and then make claims about that. Virtual unwrapping, when it works properly and when those metadata chains are set up, leaves no doubt that the text is the text. On the top, you see an unwrapped section of a medieval manuscript that we scanned in Chartres. And on the bottom, you see part of the Getty scroll. And let me show you what the data from the Chartres manuscripts looks like. And when you see the data, this is the micro-computed tomography as a volume. As you see the data, you tell me if you can't tell that there's writing visible. Okay, now I'm going to turn this volume through a little bit of enhancement into a transparent volume, and what you should see is word soup. You see all the 3 dimensions and all the layers, but I've enhanced just the letters that are floating in this volume. They actually are positioned on real material, but we haven't done the process yet of all of the unwrapping. But would you doubt that the data is there? No, you would not. All we need is the metadata chain to be able to confirm that any claims that come from this can be confirmed by external peer-reviewed sources. All right, so now I move to today on our short timeline. What about Herculaneum? Why haven't we been able to read it? Why am I not presenting a completely unwrapped Herculaneum scroll today? We've been frustrated by Herculaneum ink. I, as a computer scientist, have been frustrated by Herculaneum ink. You've heard of the frustrations from the papyrologists. I went back to the lab and I took carbon ink, and I made some experiments because I'd been told that you're never going to see carbon in computed tomography. It just didn't feel right to me, but that's what the conventional wisdom has been. So I put a bunch of carbon on index cards, And then I scanned it, and guess what? You can see carbon just fine in computed tomography because things aren't invisible, all right? They just might not be visible yet to the human eye. What you see here is an edge-on view of the index card with a big glop of carbon sitting there. And at the right resolution, I could see that because it's not all flat, there's a bump. Bump must be the carbon. Here's what we've discovered about seeing carbon ink in computed tomography. Which side do you think the papyrus is? Which side do you think the ink is? Can you tell that there's a difference between the two? Yeah, you can. The ink has this black, cracked look with features that show you that it's probably ink on top of something. The papyrus has this different look that shows you a texture that's different. This is from scanning electron microscope. Why can't we pull these features out of tomography and use them to be able to see the ink? Well, it turns out that you can if you have a high enough resolution. So at a very high resolution, can you see where the ink goes through the middle of this circle and the papyrus is on the top and the ink is on the bottom? I'm going to blur it a little bit. It gets a little harder, right? I'm going to blur it a little bit more. Almost impossible. The resolution, it turns out, really matters. If you scan things at too low a resolution, you can't see what you want. So now I want to show you an experiment that we did in the lab to riff on this idea of resolution matters. The carbon phantom is something we created out of pure carbon ink. We made a bunch of symbols, and we numbered the columns 1 to 6, where 1 is only one layer of carbon, and 6 is 6 applications of carbon. And the dots are made out of iron gall so that we can see them in the X-ray very easily. We knew that we would not see the carbon very well. Then we used a machine learning technique to say, you know what? I know where the ink ought to be, because I made this target. I'm going to train up the system to recognize where the ink is and calculate a way to predict where it might find ink, and we're going to see if we can make that work. In other words, we think that the evidence of the carbon is there, just not visible to the naked eye, and that we can tease it out. So here's the original picture as a reference, and here's what we get when we scan that phantom in computed tomography. On the right-hand side, which is the column 6, you see faintly extra density where their carbon is really thick, because then it's visible to the naked eye. But at 5 applications, working from right to left, you see less evidence, down to columns 1 and 2 where you can see nothing. Now, we've trained a network, we've trained a machine learning system to be able to amplify that ink, and here is what we get when we do the amplification. What we get is the ability to detect almost down to the single layer application of carbon the presence of the ink. Now, this amplification is happening because we've created a reference library that shows where the ink is and where the ink is not, and then we learn the subtlety of that in the tomography, and then from the tomography alone, we're able to amplify the evidence of the ink even though we can't see it with the naked eye. An additional benefit is that we can render the same thing into something that looks photorealistic. So this is not a photo. This is rendered from tomography alone, but because we have a reference library that helps us make it photorealistic, we can create something that looks almost like we had taken a photo of it, but only from the tomography. Does that make sense? So here's the triptych of the 4 things to compare. The photo on top, the tomography that we can acquire as the second row, the machine learning amplification as the third row, and then the photorealistic rendering from tomography alone on the 4th. What we realized in doing this work is that we think that we've developed a recipe that will allow us to see Herculaneum ink in tomography and then do virtual unwrapping. The recipe includes this notion of artificial intelligence or machine learning using a convolutional neural network. And I don't think this is probably the forum to go more deeply into that. But let me say the recipe is a numbers game. It's about resolution. If you scan something at 12 microns, you're going to have 2,100 pixels per inch to play with. And if you scan it at 5 microns, you're going to have 5,000 pixels per inch to play with. Okay? So that numbers game, edge on, gives you maybe 17 pixels through the thickness of the layer of papyrus to play with. If the ink is only on one side and part of that, you might have 2 or 3 pixels at 12 microns. But if you go down to 5, You might have 6 or 7 pixels that you can play with that are going to show ink. And it's not unlike what NASA does when they run the Hubble telescope. So if you look up at the sky and you see the stars, they're beautiful, the moon. With your naked eye, you're going to be able to appreciate those. But at the very lower part of this diagram, you see a very small section of sky that the Hubble scans at super high resolution. And when it does that, it finds that in that really small section of the sky, you can see untold galaxies. Now, imagine if you could do that across the entire night sky, you'd have a catalog of the entire thing. What we're essentially trying to do is to create a telescope looking into the Herculaneum scroll at the resolution we need to be able to see the carbon on the ink and then do virtual unwrapping. Okay, let me go through an example and then we'll get to tomorrow. Example we did last year involved this fragment, and you can see it circled in blow up. This fragment gave us the chance on a single authentic piece to test our theory that machine learning could help us amplify this ink from tomography. So on the left you see the photograph, and on the right you see what we actually got when we did the tomography of that single piece. Now, what's really hard here is that we have to have a reference library. We have to have examples of ink to do the training. So what we did here is a 9-fold experiment. We divided the area of the ink into 9 regions. We would leave one out and train on 8, and then use that network to classify the one we left out, and then we repeated that 9 times. The result of that experiment gave us this side by side, the original photo and the tomography with no visible ink in the tomography. And then the machine learning showing us that there's evidence of the ink, and then an amplification that actually worked. One single letter form. You know why we did this experiment with one letter form? Because we couldn't get our hands on any other letter forms. Somehow it was possible to pour mercury on scrolls, and it was possible to cut them with a knife, but it wasn't possible for us to do X-ray scans until recently. And thanks to the Getty and this exhibit, we've had a breakthrough in our ability to do work because we've been able to collect data that we've never had before. And I'm going to show you some of that data from the very scrolls that are in this exhibit. We helped with Ken Lepatin and the Getty to build some of the cases that were necessary for transport and ultimately for display. But in a self-interested way, those cases were also helpful for us to be able to collect data. When you do the microcomputed tomography of a scroll and the conservation is paramount, it has to be mounted in such a way so that no damage is done. And so this photogrammatic method allowed us to create custom fitting cases that were used for the transport of the scrolls and also for the scanning of the scrolls. And here you see 2 conservators from the library in Naples, Fabrizio and Luigi, and they are working with our cases to help us acquire data. And we did this in partnership with the UCLA College of Dentistry. We thank them for allowing us to use their facility to collect this data. Over the course of about a week, just prior to the opening of this exhibit, we were able to collect microcomputed tomography on two of the 3 scrolls that you see in the exhibit here. And I want to show you that data. So no one has ever seen this outside our lab. So I saved it for this audience, and I thank you for coming. You are now seeing the internal structure of the scrolls that upstairs you can only see the external structure of. And that's thanks to microcomputed tomography. As you look at this, you might think, well, that's pretty daunting. I don't know if anybody's ever going to read anything inside of that. I think that pretty much every day that I look at this data. If you take a look at one slice and I blow it up, you'll see the structure and the need for resolution because those layers are packed pretty closely together. And it makes the problem extremely difficult. Another view of the scroll in its case, and this one I'm going to show you axially and also from the side so that you can get a sense of the incredible geometry from the forces that occurred when this thing was carbonized. So the axial view, you can see evidence still of the umbilical, the very bright spot in the center is the evidence from the wood peg that the scroll was wound on. And then when I tip this back up and I show you the side view, you'll see that the scroll was also crushed in this direction, and you'll see the wrinkles in that direction. Both of those things make it a terrible candidate for regular unwrapping. It's probably why this one lasted in the state, because They already realized from the beginning it was hopeless by looking at the outside. When I see these data, I realize that the folks who did the unwrapping were doomed from the beginning because most of the layers were already broken before they ever started the ability to do the restoration. Here you have fragment 245 again with a view that shows the ink a little bit more clearly, but now I'm going to show you the computed tomography that we have. The ink being visible makes this a perfect candidate for a reference library that could train the machine learning approach to be able to recognize the ink on papyrus in a closed scroll. So in an ironic twist, the fragments that have been opened showing visible text, we think, have become the key to unlock the ability to see the ones that are still closed, because it allows us to build a reference library, which, if we add to the engine for discovery, just becomes another twist in the engineering story about how to solve this problem, but ultimately gets collapsed into yet another sophisticated camera, which we can then use to actually provide a reading, which is my goal. So in conclusion, I would like you to help me see if we can see a letter form coming purely from tomography, carbon ink from Herculaneum, and I hope that we can get an up or down vote on whether we're on the right track. So I'm going to show you the data first. This is the tomography. This is a small fragment about the size of the palm of your hand. And the data is at about 3 to 4 micron resolution, which is very high resolution. Okay, now you've seen everything you need to know. The surface. This might be what you would see if you were able to look at this under a microscope, except there's no visible ink because it comes from tomography. Why did we scan an open fragment? It's because we know the right answer, so we have our scientific control. It's high resolution. If I took just this area and I blew it up, I can see incredible detail, but no evidence of writing. All right, so what we did is we trained our neural network to do machine learning on the left-hand side, and then we pretended like we'd never seen the right-hand side, and we classified. So the right-hand side's not been seen by the method. We've only trained on the ink that's visible in the left. I'm not going to tell you what letter form is visible, but I'm going to give you the scale, because the scale is actually really important. That's about the size of the letter form that you're going to be looking for on the right-hand side of this example. And I'm going to play you a little video that is the training. Starting with no training, train, and then near the end of that sequence, you should see the letters appear. That is the machine learning the signature of the carbon ink. Are you ready? Papyrologists, are you ready? I'm looking for one Greek letter on the right-hand side about the size of that delta. Okay, at massive resolution, it sometimes is better to see it in thumbnail. Okay, does anybody have a guess as to what the letter is? It is omega. You are all papyrologists. We are all papyrologists. All right, so what we've shown is that you can see carbon ink in tomography. You can see the ink of Herculaneum. And we can do virtual unwrapping. So I think omega is the right place to end. Thank you very much.